Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. Picture a village of fewer than 600 souls pressed between salt marsh and forest, where the meeting house is the center of every argument, every marriage, every accusation. By the time the trials ended that autumn, 19 men and women had been hanged on Gallows Hill. One man pressed to death beneath stones, and at least 5 more had died waiting in chains. But the story did not end with the executions. It moved. It went into the surnames of the surviving families, into the children who fled westward, into the lines that changed their names, or married out of the county, or simply went quiet for a generation, until the shame passed. What very few genealogists have fully traced is how those surnames traveled, what they carried with them, and what the DNA record shows when you look at the descendants today. The surname clusters from the Salem trials are not random. They form a specific pattern, a network of intermarried families concentrated in Essex County, Massachusetts, who were either accused, who testified as accusers, who lost land and standing in the aftermath, or who were the magistrates and ministers whose decisions sealed the outcome. Those families left a paper trail that is unusually well preserved, because Salem's court records survived. What did not always survive was the willingness to speak about it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Begin with the name Nurse. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old when she was hanged on Gallows Hill in July of 1692. She had been a respected member of the Salem village community for decades, a grandmother, a churchgoer, a woman whose neighbors initially signed a petition in her defense. The petition did not save her. The court that convicted her on spectral evidence was not interested in character witnesses. What the court was interested in was the internal conflicts of Salem village, the land disputes, the factional politics between the village and the town of Salem proper, and the network of families who had been feuding over boundaries and ministerial appointments for a decade before the first accusation was ever made. The Nurse family's land was at the center of one of those disputes. After her execution, her son spent years attempting to clear her name and recover the family's standing. The name Nurse persists in New England genealogical records well into the 18th century, concentrated in Essex, Middlesex, and York counties, before branches spread south and west along the Connecticut River Valley and eventually into Pennsylvania and Virginia. If that surname appears in your family tree with roots in eastern Massachusetts before 1750, you are looking at a line that was present during the trials and carried that presence forward through every subsequent generation. The name Proctor carries a different weight. John Proctor was one of the few men accused during the trials, a tavern keeper and farmer who made the mistake of speaking publicly about his skepticism of the proceedings. He called the afflicted girls liars. He said it aloud, in company, and in the climate of 1692, that statement was as close to a death warrant as a man could write for himself. He was hanged in August. His wife Elizabeth, who was also accused and condemned, survived only because she was pregnant at the time of sentencing. The court would not execute a pregnant woman. She gave birth in prison, and that child, born in a Salem jail cell while her father was already dead, was among the ancestors through whom the Proctor line continued. The family was scattered, their property was seized. The social cost of being a proctor in Essex County in the years immediately following the trials was steep enough that some members of the family relocated. The name appears in New Hampshire records, in Connecticut, in the later western Massachusetts settlements. When you trace proctor lines backward from those later locations, a significant number resolve to Essex County between 1650 and 1710. The Good family is harder to trace by surname alone because Sarah Good, who was one of the first 3 women accused in the hysteria, left a daughter named Dorcas, who was herself arrested at the age of 4 or 5. Dorcas Good was chained in prison for months. Her father, William Good, was not executed, but he did not manage to secure his daughter's release for an extended period, and the psychological damage to the child was documented by contemporaries. The family was already poor before the accusations. Afterward, they were destitute. Tracing the Good surname from Salem requires genealogical patience, because the family had limited land holdings that would generate records. What survives are the court documents themselves and a few later references in town records. The surname is less useful as a marker than the family connections. William Good's relatives and neighbors, the families whose land adjoined theirs, the people who testified about her or against her, those are the networks worth examining. The name Putnam is unavoidable in any serious reading of the Salem record. The Putnam family, particularly Thomas Putnam and his daughter Anne, were central to the accusation network. Anne Putnam Jr. was among the most active of the afflicted accusers. She named dozens of people. Years later, in 1706, she stood before her congregation and made a formal public apology, the only accuser to do so. She said she had been deluded by Satan and had been an instrument for the accusing of several persons of a grievous crime, for which cause I desire to lie in the dust and to be humbled for it. That statement was recorded. It appears in the transcript of the Salem Village Church meeting. The Putnam name spread widely from Essex County, and today it appears across New England, the mid-Atlantic states, and into the Ohio Valley. The family's land holdings were substantial and their descendants numerous. If you carry Putnam ancestry from colonial Massachusetts, the question is not whether the trials are in your lineage. The question is which side of the proceedings your particular line stood on, and whether any record exists to specify. The Parris surname opens a different kind of inquiry. Samuel Parris was the minister of Salem Village, whose household was the origin point of the entire crisis. His daughter Betty and his niece Abigail Williams were the first to exhibit the strange behavior that the community interpreted as witchcraft, and it was Parris who brought the slave woman Tituba into the story, who directed the initial questioning, and who continued to press accusations, even after the hysteria had destroyed his congregation's trust in him. He was eventually forced out of the Salem Village pulpit. He moved to Stowe, Massachusetts, then to Concord, then to Dunstable, and he died in relative obscurity in 1720. His descendants left Essex County and spread through central and western Massachusetts. The Parris name is less common than Putnam or Nurse in later genealogical records, which makes it a more specific marker when it does appear. A Parris ancestry resolving to eastern Massachusetts before 1720 is placing you within one or two generations of the man who stood at the center of the greatest legal atrocity in colonial American history. The Corey name carries the trial's most dramatic death. Giles Corey was 80 years old. He was accused, and rather than submit to trial, he refused to enter a plea. Under the law of the time, a defendant who refused to plead could be subjected to peine forte et dure, the practice of pressing with heavy stones until the accused either entered a plea or died. Giles Corey was pressed to death over 2 days. The account that survives from witnesses says that as more weight was added, his tongue was forced from his mouth, and the sheriff pressed it back with the end of his cane. His wife Martha was hanged 3 days later. Giles Corey left no direct heirs who survived with the surname intact, but the family network around him, his neighbors, the families of his previous marriages, the people who appear in his land transactions before the trials, form a cluster of Essex County names that genealogists working on colonial Massachusetts will recognize immediately. The Corey surname appears in New England records after the trials through collateral lines, and tracing it requires distinguishing between families who had no connection to Salem and families who arrived in Massachusetts before 1690 and held land in Essex County. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The name Hathorne requires particular attention. John Hathorne was one of the examining magistrates during the trials, one of the men who conducted the initial hearings, and whose aggressive questioning style effectively presumed guilt before any formal court proceeding began. He was not a judge in the technical sense during the early hearings, but his role in directing the accusation process was central enough that his name appears repeatedly in the surviving records. His descendant, the novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne, added the W to the family name specifically to distance himself from the association. That name change is documented. Hawthorne wrote about the sense of inherited guilt that he felt about his ancestors' conduct, and those feelings directly shaped The Scarlet Letter and several of his other works. The Hathorne family, with and without the W, spread through New England and into the mid-Atlantic and southern states. If you carry this surname, or the Hathorne variant, and your line resolves to Essex County in the colonial period, you are carrying one of the most legibly documented inheritances from the trials. The Willard surname appears in the record in a specific way. John Willard was executed in August of 1692 after being accused by members of the extended Putnam network. He had previously been a constable in Salem Village, and there is evidence in the record that his accusation was connected in part to his refusal to continue arresting accused witches, a task he apparently found unconscionable. His refusal to comply with the proceedings cost him his life. The Willard name spreads through New England in the 18th century, appearing in Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts, before moving further into New York and Ohio. A Willard ancestry from colonial Massachusetts with roots before 1710 places you within the trial generation, and the specific concentration of Willard families in Essex and Middlesex counties in the colonial records makes this a trackable surname. The Bishop name opens the question of the executions in sequence. Bridget Bishop was the first person executed during the Salem Witch Trials, hanged on June 10, 1692. She had been accused before, in an earlier round of witchcraft accusations in the 1680s, and had survived that earlier proceeding. Her survival may have made her an easier target in 1692, since her accusers could point to prior suspicion. She ran an unlicensed tavern, wore a scarlet coat, and apparently had a way of looking at people that her neighbors found unsettling. The record against her was the thinnest of spectral evidence and neighbor testimony about damaged property and unexplained illness. She was convicted and executed within 2 months of the first accusations. The Bishop surname from Essex County colonial records appears in Connecticut and Rhode Island before spreading further south, and genealogical work connecting Bishop lines to eastern Massachusetts before 1700 is connecting them to a family that was inside the trial's first and most violent chapter. The English family, specifically Philip English and his wife Mary, offers a different trajectory. They were among the wealthiest people in Salem town, as distinct from Salem village, and when they were accused, they were able to do something that most of the accused could not. They escaped. They fled to New York. Mary English died shortly after returning to Massachusetts, possibly from the effects of her imprisonment, and Philip English spent years attempting to recover his confiscated property through the courts. He recovered some of it. The English surname in colonial Massachusetts is complicated by its common nature, but Philip English's family is specific enough in its land holdings and court records to be traceable, and his descendants appear in Essex County records through the early 18th century before spreading into broader New England. The Easty name is one of the most carefully documented in the trial record. Mary Easty, sister of Rebecca Nurse, was condemned and executed in September of 1692. Before her execution, she wrote a petition. She was not writing it for herself. She had accepted that she would die. She was writing it for the people who would come after her, asking the court to examine its procedures more carefully so that no more innocent people would be condemned. That petition survives. It is held in the collections of the Peabody Essex Museum. It is one of the few documents from the trials that reads not as accusation or defense, but as advocacy for others from someone who has nothing left to lose. The Easty surname, sometimes spelled Easty or Easty, traces through Essex County descendants into New Hampshire and Maine, and the family connections through Mary Easty's husband Isaac Easty form a network of colonial Massachusetts families that genealogists working the trial period will recognize from multiple record types. The Jacobs name carries a specific detail that the documentary record preserved by accident. George Jacobs Sr. was executed in August of 1692. His property was confiscated. His grandson, also named George Jacobs, was accused along with him but escaped from custody and fled. The younger George Jacobs' flight was recorded because it generated legal documents about his absence and about the attempt to seize his portion of the family's property. He eventually returned after the hysteria had collapsed, and the colonial government began the process of trying to make restitution to survivors and heirs. The restitution process itself, which extended into the early 18th century, generated a body of records that genealogists can still consult. The Jacobs family claims in those restitution records name family members, relationships, and property locations that allow traceable lines to be constructed forward into the later colonial period. The Dane family is worth noting for a specific reason. The Reverend Francis Dane was the minister of Andover, the town that contributed more accused persons to the Salem trials than any other community. He was an opponent of the proceedings. Several members of his family, including his daughter and granddaughter, were accused. He wrote letters arguing against the court's methods, and specifically criticizing the use of spectral evidence, the claim that a witch's spirit could appear to a victim without the witch's conscious knowledge or consent. His opposition was documented, and it put him at some risk. The Dane family spread through Essex County and the surrounding region, and the surname appears in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont in the 18th century. A Dane ancestry from this region carries you into the center of the institutional debate about the trials, not as an accuser and not as a victim, but as a voice of early, formal opposition to proceedings that the colonial government itself would eventually disavow. What the DNA record shows when researchers look at New England colonial populations is a high degree of relatedness among the Essex County families of the 1690s. The founding population of Massachusetts Bay Colony was not large. The families who arrived between 1630 and 1650 intermarried intensively for several generations. The trial participants on every side of the proceedings, accusers, accused, magistrates, ministers, witnesses, were often connected by blood as well as by neighborhood. When genealogists trace the descendants of the Salem trial families today, they frequently find that people who have 2 or 3 separate lines connecting to colonial Massachusetts converge, because the founding population was small enough that divergence was unlikely across 5 or 6 generations of intensive within-community marriage. The genetic signature of a New England colonial ancestry is not a single marker. It is a cluster of connections, a network that resolves, when traced carefully, to a few hundred families who were all present, within roughly 50 miles of each other, in the decades around 1692. The Foster surname appears in Andover's trial records connected to Anne Foster, an elderly widow who was accused and who died in prison in 1692 before her case could be resolved. Her daughter Mary Lacey Sr. and her granddaughter Mary Lacey Jr. were also accused, and both confessed under examination, which under the logic of the trial proceedings was taken as confirmation. The Foster and Lacey names appear in Essex and Middlesex County records in the years after the trials, and trace forward into central Massachusetts and New Hampshire in the 18th century. An ancestry connecting through these Andover families places you inside the trial's second major geographic node, the community that fed the largest number of accused into the Essex County jails. The Carrier name carries a specific historical irony. Martha Carrier was executed in August of 1692. Cotton Mather, the Boston minister whose theological framework did more than any other single piece of writing to validate the trial proceedings, called her the Queen of Hell in his account of the executions. Her sons Richard and Andrew were also accused, and under extended examination that later testimony described as involving physical pressure, they confessed and named their mother. After the trials collapsed, Richard Carrier recanted his confession in writing. That recantation is in the record. The Carrier surname traces from Essex County into Connecticut and western Massachusetts, and the family's descendants include, by some genealogical accounts, President Franklin Pierce, though that connection requires careful verification against primary records rather than family tradition alone. What the restitution records of the early 18th century show, when read alongside the trial records, is the geographic dispersal that followed the proceedings. Families moved. Some moved immediately, selling or abandoning property in Essex County within a few years of the trials. Some stayed and fought for restitution, which the Massachusetts colonial government eventually granted in a formal legislative reversal in 1711, though the amounts paid were often far below the actual losses. The surnames that appear in those restitution filings form a roster: Nurse, Proctor, Carrier, Easty, Jacobs, Parker, Wardwell, Wildes, Corey, Good, Hobbs. If your family history includes any of these names with roots in eastern Massachusetts before 1720, you are looking at families the colonial government formally acknowledged had been wronged, which means the records are unusually detailed and the genealogical trail is unusually traceable. The name Wardwell deserves its own mention. Samuel Wardwell was a carpenter in Andover who initially confessed to witchcraft under examination, then recanted his confession, was brought back to court, convicted on the recantation itself being treated as evidence of guilt, and was executed in September of 1692. The logic that condemned him is worth holding in full view, he had confessed. Then he said the confession was false, and the court determined that his willingness to die rather than maintain a false confession was itself suspicious. That logic collapsed under its own weight within months. The Wardwell family spread through Essex County into New Hampshire and Maine, and genealogical records connecting to Andover between 1680 and 1720 carry a high probability of touching this line. The surnames that ran from Salem did not all go north and west. Some went south. Virginia and North Carolina received waves of New England migrants in the early and mid-18th century, and some of those migrants were carrying surnames and family memories that they had every reason not to advertise. When you see a Massachusetts surname appearing in Virginia land records around 1730 to 1760 without an obvious commercial or military reason for the move, it is worth asking what the family was leaving behind. The Salem trial surnames are not the only reason a colonial New England family might relocate. but they are one of the documented patterns that genealogists working on Appalachian ancestry occasionally find beneath the surface of families that claimed Virginia or Carolina origins by the time their descendants began keeping records again. There is a dimension of the Salem record that genealogists sometimes overlook because it sits at the edge of the primary court documents. The community of Topsfield, directly north of Salem Village, contributed a cluster of accused persons whose family connections ran deep into the Nurse extended family network. The names Town, Easty, and Cloyce all refer to sisters: Mary Town Easty, Rebecca Town Nurse, and Sarah Town Cloyce, 3 daughters of one Topsfield family who all became targets of the accusations. Rebecca was hanged. Mary was hanged. Sarah Cloyce escaped conviction partly because her husband Peter Cloyce was persistent in his legal defense of her, and partly because the proceedings had begun to collapse before her case was fully resolved. The town surname from Topsfield therefore connects genealogically to 2 of the hanged women and to a 3rd who survived. If you carry town ancestry from northeastern Massachusetts in the colonial period, you are close to the center of the familial networks the trial destroyed. The Cloyce descendants spread through Essex and Middlesex counties and into the Connecticut River Valley, and that migration trajectory is consistent with what other trial-adjacent families did in the years following 1692. The minister George Burroughs requires particular attention because his execution was the most theologically charged of all the trial deaths. Burroughs had been a previous minister of Salem Village, had left the position under circumstances that generated lingering resentment, and was living in Maine when he was arrested and brought back. He was accused of being the organizing figure behind the entire witch conspiracy. At his execution, according to contemporary accounts, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly from the scaffold, which was understood at the time as something a witch could not do. The crowd wavered. Cotton Mather intervened from horseback, urging them not to be deceived, and the execution proceeded. The Burroughs surname is less common in later New England records than the others, partly because his family connections in the region were fewer, and partly because the associations were difficult. But the name appears in Maine records and in later Massachusetts documents, and descendants who were in the region before 1700 were navigating a social landscape shaped entirely by what happened to him on that hill. The restitution process the Massachusetts General Court undertook between 1703 and 1711 named specific families and specific amounts. The legislature passed formal legislation in 1711, reversing the attainders of those who had been condemned, voiding their convictions posthumously, so that heirs could theoretically recover what had been taken. The Nurse family received £30. The Proctor heirs received £150. The differences reflected partly the scale of property seizures and partly the persistence of families in pressing their claims. Families who had relocated entirely received nothing or very little because the restitution process required someone present in the colony to file the claim. That detail is genealogically significant. The families most fully represented in the restitution records are the families who stayed, while the families most difficult to trace in later colonial records may be the ones who left rather than fight for compensation in a place that had hanged their parents or grandparents. The question that most descendants eventually arrive at is not whether the trials happened or whether the surnames connect. The court records are preserved. The question is what it means to carry these names now, 2.5 centuries after the hangings and the stones and the prison deaths, after the formal apologies and the legislative reversals and the statue erected to Rebecca Nurse in Danvers, which is what Salem Village was eventually renamed. What it means is this: your line survived something that was designed to destroy it. The accusation system of 1692 was built on a specific structure: neighbor against neighbor, family against family, confession purchased by the promise of survival for those who named others. The families whose names appear in those records on every side navigated that structure under conditions of genuine terror, and they came out the other side and had children and moved and continued. The DNA they passed forward carries no mark of the trials. A genome does not know about spectral evidence, but the surname does. The record does. The migration pattern does. And if you are looking at a family tree that includes Nurse, Proctor, Carrier, Hathorne, Putnam, Easty, Corey, Wardwell, Jacobs, Wilds, Parker, Bishop, or any of the other surnames the court documents name across both the accused and the accuser networks, then you are looking at direct evidence of a family that was present at one of the few moments in American history when an entire community turned on itself under pressure and then had to live with what it had done. The genealogical work on Salem is unusually well supported by primary records, because the trials generated so much paperwork. the examination transcripts, the confessions, the petitions, the restitution claims, the church records, the land transfers that followed the property seizures. These documents exist in archives and in the collections at the Peabody Essex Museum and the Massachusetts State Archives. Researching a Salem ancestry is difficult not because the records are missing, but because the volume of interconnected documentation requires a methodical approach. The best entry point is the surname, then the county, then the specific township within Essex County, and then the court records themselves, which are indexed well enough that a surname search will return the relevant documents within a reasonable amount of research time. What the trial record preserved, beyond the names and the dates and the testimony, is a portrait of how a community under pressure behaves. The accusation networks in Salem followed social fault lines that had existed for years before the first accusation. The families who accused tended to be the families whose land disputes had been running longest, whose factional conflicts within the village had sharpened most in the years before 1692. The families accused first tended to be the families on the losing side of those disputes, the people with less social protection, the people whose reputations were already complicated. As the proceedings expanded, the accusations began reaching people whose social standing should have protected them, and that is when the colony's leadership began to have doubts, and that is when the end came. But the end came too late for 19 people who were already dead. The names on that list are the names to carry forward in any serious investigation of colonial Massachusetts ancestry: Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Martha Carrier, George Burroughs, the minister who was executed in August, Mary Easty, Giles and Martha Corey, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker, Alice Parker, Ann Putiator, Wilmot Redd, Margaret Scott, Susanna Martin, Sarah Good, Sarah Wilds, Elizabeth Howe, John Willard, and Bridget Bishop, first to die. These are not characters in a story. They were people with land records and church memberships and neighbors and children, and their descendants are alive and carrying their surnames today in 30 states. If your surname is on this list, or if your tree contains one of the families surrounding these individuals, the records are there to be found. The question is whether you are willing to look at what they contain. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.